budgeted for interest earnings. The South Carolina Saves is the guaranteed savings that they were going to get under their performance contract to make that payment through the contract that they entered into. The sales tax requirement, that just was what they had budgeted and what was projected from the state on what they would receive in sales tax and what was obligated there. So we like to work, you can see in column I, that's the actual levy, that's the actual amount required. What's in column H is what we like to work off of and talk to the administration about is what kind of target, where do you want to be on debt service? And so this is a 15 mil target. And so you can see that each of the years going forward, there's a little bit of a delta there. So there is in column J, that additional millage that's remaining. Now, what they may do each year when they do their $2.5 million bond issue, they may actually accelerate their payments and use that. They may have some other needs where something else is coming in, but this allows them to plan for the future and know that they do have some cash flow within their target to work with going forward. Okay. Page 14 is their constitutional debt limit report. So what you can see is the bonds in column B, C, and D is debt that is already outstanding. Column G is the aggregate amount of those planned bond issues going forward. Column H has got their total assessed value, which was pulled from their audit. Same 1% growth rate going forward. As you can see, we got the maximum debt limit for this in their case is 24 million. I believe in your all's case, it's about 6 million this year debt limit. And then you can see what capacity they have available. So if they did have a project that they wanted to do and didn't want to use any other form of financing, they could issue up to, for 2020, $15.4 million. Okay. So let's talk about now, we'll move into talking about different types of financing vehicles. That'll be on page 15. So one of the things we hit on is general obligation bonds. Those really come in two different types. One is going to be the 8% debt or 8% bonds. Those are going to be issued under this body's authority of 8% of the total tax assessed value. Then the other would be referendum. The referendum would be where you would go and ask the voters and say, for these specific projects, we would like to exceed the constitutional debt limit and borrow however much money it is you need for those projects, much like the school district here did last year. So that covers, and general obligation bonds are typically paid for with property taxes. Some folks have used other sales tax and other things paired with it as well, so that is an option. But general obligation bonds are full faith and credit of the taxpaying body. So to the extent you have issued the debt, the county auditor is going to be charged with the duty of setting a levy sufficient to make sure that those payments are made.
Just want to ask a quick question. Tommy, what's our current percentage? Do you know the current percentage that we're at with the general obligation? Is that level?
We've got about 6 million and change left in capacity.
Available?
Yeah, I think there's 6 million capacity, but there's some funds that are on hand that bring it down, according to the audit, bring it down to where you have your full debt limit available. So, that's what I thought when we were talking.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Let me move on the under general obligation bond. Would you explain somewhat the 8% option? What is that?
What that means is, under the South Carolina Constitution, local governments are afforded the latitude to issue general obligation bonds up to 8% of the total assessed value. And so, like, we look back at page 14 in the handout, you'll notice that this county, this issuer had a total assessed value of $309,478,000. That translates to a total debt limit of $24,758,000.
Yeah, so the column remaining 8% capacity.
Yeah, and so the remaining eight's what you would have available net of the limit on what you already have outstanding.
Thank you.
Okay, I think some of this may be a little clearer as we walk through them. We'll highlight, under revenue bonds, there's really 3 different types that we could look at. We could look at installment purchase revenue bonds, hospitality accommodations tax, or tax increment financing, TIF financing. Each of those have different uses, and we'll talk about those in depth in just a little bit. And then lease purchase agreements are another tool that is available. So page 16, we get into the 8% debt. And that may make it a little bit clearer. I was getting ahead of myself in the presentation, so get a little more details here for you. But it is full faith and credit. It may come from all sources, but typically most folks use ad valorem taxes. Had one issuer that did sewer projects with it, and it was basically double barreled. It was general obligation debt that was paid from the revenue from the sewer and water system. But in y'all's case, you don't operate the sewer and water, so it wouldn't necessarily apply. But that is something, if you had other streams of revenue coming in, that could be a possibility. 8% debt does not require voter approval, and it's limited to 8% of total assessment, and there we have the calculation for you of $6,438,000 is what the 8% debt limit would be for Edgefield County. Okay, page 17 gets into referendums. Same thing, it's backed by full faith and credit. One of the things is the voters requires voter approval. I was in a meeting Monday night where all the people that were on the board, they didn't necessarily think it would pass, but their thought was, we gave the people a choice on whether or not they wanted to do these projects. And that was their thinking. They knew it was a tough pill to swallow, much like the folks in Florence. It was not something that the community supported, and the community didn't want to move forward with. So you have to look at those things. But it does give the voters a chance to vote. It doesn't count against the constitutional debt limit. There can be paid for from ad valorem taxes, or you could have a capital project sales tax. You could implement a penny to help with that payment. In those sales tax collections, they may cover all of it, they may cover part of it. It really depends. Some folks use their capital project sales tax and use a blend of debt and pay as you go. Some do 100% debt, and some do 100% pay go. It just really depends on what fits. And I think the biggest thing is, how does all that fit in the timing of when you want to do projects, and does it make sense to borrow money? Will it allow you to get the projects completed sooner and hedge on inflation? Because we know that construction costs could be going up, and so you might want to maybe beneficial to hedge on that. And sometimes the penny sales tax are just set up purely as property tax relief, where it just offsets millage for the taxpayers. Revenue bonds, they can be many different types of debt. Typically they have some specific revenues pledged as the source of repayment for them. A lot of times they're tied to either a water and sewer project. In some cases they're tied to hospitality and accommodations tax. They could also be tied to TIF, where you do a tax increment financing, where you go in and you improve an area in an effort to raise the assessment and the growth in that assessment. We'll talk about that one in just a little bit. Revenue bonds don't count against the constitutional debt limit, your 8% debt limit. Sometimes the market says that they're typically a little weaker. It seems like since 2008, sometimes some investors actually look at revenue-based projects as a little bit stronger than GO, because there is that project behind it generating the source of repayment. So depending on how strong the project is, it could be considered stronger or weaker than just a traditional general obligation bond. Okay. Installment purchase revenue bonds, that's a type of financing that began in this state around 2002, 2003, Greenville County School District. It was used widely for school districts until 2006, and part of Act 388 abolished it for school districts to be able to utilize that form of financing. But it's still available for everything with the exception of school facilities can be financed with it. The county would enter into an agreement with a nonprofit corporation and lease the project. And then the nonprofit enters into a project lease back with the county, and then actually uses the funds to build the project. So, you know, the difference there is, and then what happens each year is an installment purchase payment is made from the county to the nonprofit. And when those principal payments are made, there's an undivided interest that's conveyed between the nonprofit corporation and the county.
Mike, if I could ask you a question there. The nonprofit entity
Mhm.
that would be used by the government, by the county, or can that entity be owned by the nonprofit organization owned by the government entity? Or where does this nonprofit come from?
A lot of ones we've had the governing body appointed a board to the nonprofit. And then that nonprofit, sometimes it would be former members of council or people that are friendly to the issuer or the county, and that way they would.
So it's a partnership.
Yeah, it really is a partnership. It's almost as if it is set up to be a conduit issuer on behalf of, so they're issuing on behalf of the county. And so you set up this nonprofit entity, and then you would have a board on it, and they would have, they wouldn't be paid, but they would oversee the financing of it. The monies would go from the underwriter that would issue the bonds or sell the bonds. The funds would then go to, it wouldn't just go over to this nonprofit corporation and sit in their bank account where blindly anybody could get to them. The money would then go over to a corporate trustee, such as a Regions Bank or a Wells Fargo or US Bank, and the trustee would hold the funds. As the county moved through completing the project, they would fill out disbursement request. They would send the disbursement request to the corporate trustee, and the corporate trustee would advance the funds. And then flip it around the other way, the county would make a payment to the nonprofit would actually really just go to the corporate trustee, and then they would remit it off the bondholders.
I'm just curious, what's the advantage of doing all those steps versus just paying for it yourself in this situation?
Because an installment purchase revenue bond does not count against your constitutional debt limit. If you have a $6 million debt limit. If you wanted to build a $25 million project, you have basically two options. Option one, go to voters and say, you approve us going out and borrowing $25 million for this project. Or option two, you could do an installment purchase revenue bonds where you would then enter into an agreement with the nonprofit corporation, help set them up, and then that entity would issue the debt on your behalf. You could use, it's a mechanism whereby you could use a whole basket of sources of repayment. You could use proceeds from 8% general obligation bonds. You could use some property tax money if you wanted to use property tax money. If you had hospitality and accommodations tax, you could use that as well. If you have capital project sales tax, you could use that as well. Does that make sense? So it's a way of taking multiple different sources of revenue and bundling all of them together, where sometimes there may not be a direct mechanism to tie all of those sources of revenue together for a financing. That would be one possible benefit. The other is if you wanted to, a lot of folks have used it across the state, and it's going to depend on the essentiality of those projects. The more essential, the better the pricing is going to be, the better the transaction will be. I have one client who used it for parks. We wanted to do a park, not the most essential asset in the world, because you can walk away from that park, you can decide you don't want to have an operating and they did some improvements at their city hall. And so they put city hall in, and when city hall came in, that was more essential asset that the city's not going to walk away from. But if that sort of gives a real high level on installment purchase revenue bonds. It's a unique tool, may not be right for everybody, but it could be. We just look at it, it's another tool that's in the basket that if it's appropriate and works for you and gets you, sometimes it's a matter of figuring out within the rules that we have, what gets you where you need to be. And that could be something. We have one county we work with that did an installment purchase revenue bond for a new judicial center. They were going out with a capital project sales tax later on that year, but they couldn't take a chance that the capital project sales tax would not pass. So they went ahead and moved forward with the financing and did installment purchase revenue bonds. Their source of repayment down the road was their collection of the sales tax. It was approved for next year in the election. So,
What was, just out of curiosity, what was the condition of their existing judicial center?
it burned.
It burned down.
It burned down. It was in very old, very bad shape, much like, you know, some courthouses in our state are. And they were in a situation where they had to have a new facility. And they did not want to take a chance if it did not pass. Okay. So, you know, the next page, it gets into, you know, typically they're utilized if you don't have sufficient debt limit. You know, if y'all have $50 million of debt limit, then it would be a real simple discussion. It'd just be a matter of would that fit with the village target where you want it to be. But, you know, yours is $6 million and that's not the highest debt limit available, you know. So there are projects and things you may want to consider down the road that would be above that. You know, like I said, essential projects include administrative buildings, fire and police facilities, libraries. Non-essential include recreation and tourism. You know, those are things that aren't that essential, but there may be ways of working with a bond insurer and working with the underwriter to get things to where people may want to. Hospitality accommodations tax. That is almost a newer form of financing that's available. Used to have to be done as business participation. Now, after 2010, 2011, the laws changed, but we can now issue revenue bonds that are secured by hospitality and accommodations tax. Typically, those have been used for civic centers and tourism-related projects. They have to tie back to tourism, recreational or historic facilities. Some folks have used it for roads as they deem that the roads and infrastructure have actually helped bring people into the community. I don't think beach access or renourishment is one we could ever get past here in Edgefield County for obvious reasons. We don't have a beach. So, but that is one that some of the coastal folks have been able to use. Water and sewer infrastructure to the extent that it does help with tourism, and then advertisements related to tourist development. So one of the next pieces we have is tax increment financing, also known as TIF. For a TIF, what you have to look for is an area that would be considered to be blighted, an area that does not have growth, is not exhibiting signs of growth, that it needs some help to get it going. And it's probably better to flip over to page 24 in the packet, and that may be a whole lot easier for me to explain how a TIF works looking at this graph. And you see that this graph shows that they're at $3 million. That's what this area has historically generated. You would take a geographic space that you deem to be blighted, determine what the historical tax collections have been, and that would be your set mark. And so that would be the white line above the blue area. Then you would be able to figure out what growth in assessment and what taxes it would generate, and you would let that growth pay for the bond. Typically, it's used for infrastructure in an area where you would go in and put in maybe new sidewalks, maybe some streetscaping, maybe water and sewer, or some other things. And so those are going to kickstart or spur private development and private growth in an area. And so it's not where the government's coming in and funding everything. They're coming in and funding a piece of it. And then there's gonna be private developers that come in and fund the rest. And so what happens is the area that's in green is that growth and assessment, and that if those dollars are used to repay the TIF bonds, or, you know, if there was any other money. Sometimes folks do it as pay-go. I'm not sure how pay-go works on a TIF project, haven't ever seen it happen. I've seen it where they've had an existing TIF and they were able to pay for it by continuing it. I wanted to consider, have a good relationship, because there are other taxing entities that are coterminous with the school district, with the county, and you might want to use part of their revenue in that growth area to repay those TIF bonds. But, you know, basically what happens is the tax dollars are frozen, the county, city, school district would receive exactly what they had historically been receiving. They'll still receive that going forward. And then what happens is all that growth, that money in green, all those dollars come, they get set aside in a separate pot, and they're used to either pay for the projects or pay for the bonds that might have been issued. Lease purchase agreements. Typically that is used to finance vehicles and equipment. Sometimes the lender retains title, sometimes the county will retain title on that. If it's used for equipment, it does not count against your constitutional debt limit, so it may be a way, there's things you need to finance that you didn't want to count against the 8% debt limit. A lease purchase or equipment acquisition agreement could be used. You can make use of any existing funds that you have to make those lease payments going forward, or if you needed to use the transaction was set up as an equipment acquisition agreement, you could use proceeds of GO bonds to make those payments as well. And it's set up where it has an appropriation each and every year. So you elect whether you want to appropriate or not. I would encourage you that if you entered into one of those transactions, that you would be ready to appropriate every year, because you wouldn't want to sacrifice your credit rating by saying we decide we're not going to pay for this year. So I think that kind of pulls us to what the next steps could be, what the next steps you'd want to think about, which would be establishment of refining a 5-year capital improvement plan. Those y'all got strategic plans, you got comprehensive plans. One of the things is, you know, what capital facilities, what are your capital needs? Thinking of technology, rolling stock, capital maintenance and repairs, replacement of facilities, all of those things, how those fit into the 5-year capital improvement plan. Prioritize the projects and the needs, and then determine what revenue sources that you have available, what you may want to consider. You may not have it available today, but it may be something you want to consider seeking approval for. And then developing a plan of financing to fund that capital improvement program.
Michael, I'm going to open it up to questions for all of the council. I just want to make a quick comment is, you know, I know you studied our financials. Our revenue is growing significantly. We have been fiscally conservative for a long period of time. Our debt ratio is very low. But we do have significant capital needs. We've got a new jail that's in our horizon somewhere out there, sooner rather than later. Probably an EMS. We're going to talk about a list of things that we want. Those are 2 needs. So I would like to begin the process of, you know, kind of taking the next step with you. But like when I first started sitting in this chair, I didn't know what I didn't know. And the first time we sat down and talked, you know, I'm still learning. And that was 6 months ago. So I wanted to expose these guys to that and let them have an opportunity to ask me questions.
As you said, we're introduced to a number of options here, which I find very interesting, of which I know absolutely nothing about. But I've made some notes and stuff on the side, and I presenting this to us and giving us a lot more information on certainly things that I knew little about, and that is how to finance long-term projects, where they fit. And, as the chairman said, we have some major expenses coming down the road, so it's very appropriate time that we have to deal with these issues. So thank you for your presentation.
We'll probably follow up with you, set up a follow-up meeting with our finance committee and the administrator. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Next item under budget finances, and I didn't put it on the agenda, is for Tommy to talk a little bit about a capital project sales tax, which I'm gonna let him go through. Say something about what you go through.
If I can ask a question before you started, you had mentioned that Mike and his company would come back and meet with you guys on the finance committee. Does that mean we've hired them in some way?
Nope. And there's no cost involved for them to meet with us and give us some advice.
Chairman, just a little bit about the process, how we do a capital project sales tax. The county is allowed by state law to impose a 1% sales and use tax by ordinance. It's subject to a referendum within the county, and it has to be for specific purposes for a limited amount of time to collect a limited amount of money. Basically, county council creates a commission of 6 members, and county council appoints 3 members, and municipal counties within the county appoint the other 3. An appointive index. And that index is a function of the city's population relative to the total municipal population of the county. So, it's proportionate to the population of the town. Capital project,
Tommy, does that include, North Augusta?
Yes. It would include any municipality in the county. Now, only the portion of North Augusta that's located within Edgefield County's population would be used to determine their factor.
But if I'm not mistaken, given what I think the population is in North Augusta and Edgefield County, it's probably larger.
That's my understanding. We haven't got, not Johnson or Edgefield, but they're right there with Trenton. Yes. The commission considers proposals from the general purpose and special purpose districts for funding capital projects within the county area, and that includes both the incorporated and unincorporated areas of the county. They formulate a list of projects for the ballot question, and then it comes back to county council. The county council must then authorize the capital project sales tax or ordinance as provided by the commission. In other words, what comes to you, comes back to county council, is either voted up or down. You can't say, no, we don't like this project, we're going to add this project, that type of thing.
No line item veto.
Correct. And then the referendum must be held during the next general election. Capital project sales tax can only be done during the general election cycle. If it's successful, then the sales and use tax comes back to the county, and then county council has to pass it by ordinance again. So what can you use capital project sales tax for? And this is straight out of state law. Highways, roads, streets, bridges, most any capital improvement that we would need, courthouses, administration buildings, jails, correctional facilities, detention facilities, libraries, cultural recreational facilities, water, sewer, or water and sewer projects. We could, Edgefield County Water and Sewer Authority is a special purpose district. There could be projects listed there that might be helpful to them. Flood control projects and stormwater management facilities. And then we get to the ones that Mike talked about, F and G. We don't have much use for those in this county. But then you get into, you can have a joint project between the different government entities and the combination of projects listed above. So there's a pretty wide variety there that the CPST can be used for. Projects, and this is getting back into a little bit of what you heard a minute ago, projects can be funded as pay as you go. You bring the tax money in, and you pay it as you get the tax money. And the ballot has a list, will list the projects, and you go down that ballot. Or you can do it if the commission establishes priority, which is presented on the ballot, incorporated in the ordinance. Or you can pay for it with debt service secured by revenue from the capital project sales tax. If the referendum includes the issuance of bonds, the question must be revised to include the principal amount of bonds proposed to be authorized by referendum and the source of payment of the bonds if the sales tax approved by the referendum is inadequate for the payment of bonds. With new revenue bonds, you've got to have something out there in case we come up short on the revenue. Council can only impose tax for a maximum project of 8 years for the initial bond, and that starts on May the 1st following the general election and ends April the 30th, the odd number year. And then after that, council or the county can enter into another one for a maximum period of time of 7 years. On receipt of the returns of the referendum, county council must by resolution declare the results thereof. In such an event, the referendum is declared, it's basically, you're done. And once you do the referendum's done, and it comes back to council and you approve it, it's done. Unless somebody brings suit, in legal action, concerning the capital project sales tax.
I just want to ask you a clarifying question. When you say done, those projects that were listed have to be executed?
Correct. And I reached out to the Department of Revenue and Fiscal Affairs. These numbers are provided from them. Fiscal 21-22, we received about $1.6 million. There is they do calculate anticipated growth rate there. And over an 8-year period, they estimate about $15.1 million in revenue that would be generated from capital project sales tax within Edgefield County.
I have a question for Dean, actually. So I think you're the only one that was on council when we tried this previously, and maybe you could just share with us the history of how that went, as an example.
Right. So 5, maybe 6 years ago, I lose track of time. Yeah. We tried it, and we tried it under the identical law that's here. There is no difference in the law, so just know that. It's exactly the same as it is today. We appointed the committee as outlined, did all that. You have to remember that when you do this, you're appointing you are required to appoint 3 people that are not appointed by us. So half the committee is not appointed by us. Half is, half isn't. So the people who represent the towns represent the towns. They don't represent us. The towns tap them on the shoulder and say, we appointed you, you represent us. So what that means is, when they come to the table, they're not as interested in county projects. They're interested in town projects. And that's legal, that's what they do. And so when they came to the table, and our county appointees came to the table, the 6 of them, over the course of probably, I'm gonna say it was 6 to 8 months, they met, somewhere in that neighborhood. They met with council, without council, with council, we tried to stay in touch, in individual meetings, outside of council meetings, just to talk. meaning one-on-one kind of stuff with different members that we appointed. And ultimately, what happened was, they decided to divvy up the amount of money, and then it was around $10 million, I think, give or take, that was available instead of 15. And they had divvied it up among so many projects that we encouraged them to go back and reduce some of those projects because they had too many ornaments on the Christmas tree. You know what I mean? It was just way too much. And we didn't like some of the ones that were on there to begin with. So while we couldn't change it, we could encourage them to go back, and they did. And they met and came back and said, we decided not to change anything. So our choice was voted up or down. I asked for a motion to approve, and none of the council even made a motion to approve. It failed for lack of a motion. Committee disbanded, end of discussion for that one.
And that's not uncommon. I mean, I think that's happened in multiple counties.
And just a couple of other side notes. One is if North Augusta would be eligible to get projects funded inside the city of North Augusta. But I would think, unless the ballot's different, it would have to be constructed in Edgefield County on this side. The other thing is there has been a push by the municipalities to change the law where municipalities can do a capital project sales tax independent of the counties. And the South Carolina Association of Counties position is opposed to that.
And so I just want to point out that what my bottom line is, it says 15 million, we'll never see 15 million. Even if we could we could get the committee to give us something that would be reasonable, and if voters ever approved it, I'm just kind of want 15 million to go to jail. I don't know.
Because you're saying it gets divvied up among multiple projects.
They are going to divvy it up.
Right.
You've got to have some of those, and I hate using this term, but I've heard it used several times in these times. You've got to have some of the sex projects to get people to vote for.
So, a question for that experience. When that committee set out in the beginning, how long do you think it was going to take? You said it took that committee 8 months.
6 or 8, I remember, it's about.
Did they have a goal of trying to do it in 90 days and it ended up being 8 months, or?
We started, gotta say this, so you have to do it in a general election. The general election was whatever year, let's say it was 2014. That means we would have started in the summer of 2013. Because of deadlines, you have to meet long before.
For us to do it in this general election year, we file with the state in August, correct? That's what I'm doing.
And it has to be an ordinance, so that backs it up to June, when the first reading for the ordinance would be. We would have to, the first time you could do a resolution, forming the committee would be in February, and then you got to get the towns on board. They would have to meet and gather all these lists and compile, to get it on the 2020, it's like Mr. Campbell said, they worked on it over a year last time. That's be kind of a heavy lift. If we had, and we'd also need to get some legal counsel and involved, make sure we do it right and don't get it messed up. So to get it to 2020 would be a pretty heavy lift for the county at this phase, in my opinion. Now, if council wants it, we do our best.
Well, I noticed, McCormick County, they tried it several times before they got it passed in McCormick County. But I think they finally passed it last year, I believe it was. So I think it's just lack of people being schooled, you know, to get the referendum passed.
I think the first one is the hardest.
Okay.
And not only for the public, but also for staff in developing it.
Okay.
When you've got the ordinance and you're just changing the projects and the percentages, you have it in place, then it's easier to cut and paste, so to speak. Whereas the first one, we're not cutting and pasting, we're creating.
county or the cities came back and had their list, and you discussed, can you modify those lists before? I mean, you said you asked them to go back and reduce their list, they had too many projects? So that was the only thing that could be done, was to reduce their list?
In that particular instance, yes. They wouldn't wanna add anything else, it's already too big. They were trying to cover too many things in too many places.
Yeah.
Trying to satisfy too many people.
I'm just trying to figure out that, you invest so much time in a project like this, and the county puts forth a major project. And if there's such parochial interest within those other three areas, they can shoot this thing right down, because you're just not gonna be able to compass any sort of a conclusion to fund a major project the county has.
A question I have for us is, I mean, I recognize, I don't know if you said candy or sexy items or what need to be tied to it. But do you think the municipalities understanding the need for a new jail would motivate them to be quicker this time? Since that's a new jail facility, it's not a county issue alone, we all need it. Do you think that would help expedite it?
I would agree with that thinking. I'm just concerned is whether they agree with that thinking. When the last time they went out, they dealt with what they thought were town projects that they needed, and didn't really get on board with county projects. I agree with you. I would hope that somebody recognizes the issues before the county regarding a new jail. We're lucky the state hasn't forced us to do it already. We've been lucky. Somewhere down the road, the state's gonna come up and force us to do something, and if we haven't done something, we're gonna have to stand there and farm these out, and it's just gonna be a great big mess. And I'm not too sure that we have the time to try to go out, and certainly it doesn't appear that we have the time to put this together to try to convince the other municipalities, putting something like this together in time for 2020. So then you're talking 2024. Or
2022.
2022. And I'd be surprised if the state waits for us to do this. I mean, I don't wanna cry wolf, but the state's been patient. And whether people know it or not, I know we put it out, that the state sent us a letter indicating that we had an issue, but never pushed the letter to the point of saying, you better get it done now or within a certain period of time. So, I mean, we've needed a jail before I even came on council. And it is a big blockbuster in money. And to sit there and depend on this, I also get concerned about our general projection on revenue generated over 15 years. Certainly isn't gonna cover that project.
And that's only over 8 years, but even if we had every penny going to a detention center, it would not cover just the detention center portion of it.
Yeah.
Now, I did talk to Mr. Gallagher some before our meeting, and, you know, not the lease purchase, but it's similar to that with the nonprofit.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be set up, and there may be some ways to craft that, and then the capital project sales tax comes later to help fund that, and then if it fails, then, you know, it goes on the debt service, just like the school bonds did.
Mm-hmm.
That it'll be this much, but, that's just some of the options.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how to make it fit.
Out of respect to our next speaker, I don't wanna interrupt anybody, but what I think we can circle back to this in the final hour. I recommend we take a 5-minute recess, and then